Welcome to Mr. Carter Stories. Dear viewers, I'm thrilled to welcome you to a world where love, fate, and destiny collide in the most unexpected ways. Here, every story is filled with heart-stopping romance, gripping twists, and emotions that will stay with you long after you've turned the last page. At Mr. Carter Stories, we believe in the kind of love that defies time, challenges fate, and heals even the deepest wounds. Whether it's a powerful billionaire, a strong heroine, or a love story that brings tears to your eyes, you'll find it all right here. So if you're ready to lose yourself in tales of passion, heartbreak, and happily ever afters, make sure to subscribe, like, and share so you never miss a single moment of these unforgettable stories. Your journey into love begins now. Are you ready? Hit that subscribe button and let the magic begin. With love, Mr. Carter Stories. The streets of New York glistened under the relentless downpour, the city alive with flickering neon lights and the distant hum of sirens. Isabella Evans pulled her coat tighter around her frame as she hurried down the dimly lit street, her breath fogging up in the cold air. She had just finished her late shift at a small diner, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders, when a sudden screech of tires shattered the quiet night. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the source of the sound. A sleek black car skidded out of control, crashing violently into a streetlight. The impact was deafening, metal crunching against metal. Without a second thought, Isabella rushed forward, her sneakers splashing through puddles as she sprinted toward the wreckage. Smoke curled from under the hood, flames licking at the shattered windshield. The driver inside was slumped against the wheel, blood trickling down his forehead. Isabella's pulse spiked in panic. "Sir, can you hear me?" she shouted, shaking his shoulder. No response. With adrenaline coursing through her veins, she fumbled with the door handle, yanking it open with all her strength. The acrid scent of gasoline filled the air, a stark warning that she had only moments to act. Summoning every ounce of energy, she wrapped her arms around the unconscious man and pulled him from the wreck just as flames erupted behind them. They collapsed onto the wet pavement, Isabella gasping for air. She turned to examine the man she had just saved. Even through the blood and darkness, his sharp jawline and tailored suit spoke of wealth and power. The flickering streetlight illuminated his face, and her breath hitched. Adrian Carter. The name sent a shockwave through her. She had seen his face on the cover of Forbes, in news articles, and on financial television reports. Adrian Carter, the ruthless and enigmatic billionaire CEO of Carter Enterprises, now lay unconscious in her arms. Fear and uncertainty gripped her, but she couldn't leave him here. A glance around the empty street told her no help was coming soon. Making a split-second decision, she hailed a cab and directed it to her tiny Brooklyn apartment. Adrian awoke to the scent of lavender and the soft glow of a dimly lit room. His body ached and his head pounded. He groaned, trying to sit up, when a gentle yet firm hand pressed against his chest. "You need to rest," a soothing voice said. His eyes fluttered open, locking onto a pair of deep brown ones filled with concern. The woman before him was breathtaking. Dark waves of hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her full lips were slightly parted, as if she wanted to say something but hesitated. "Where am I?" he rasped, his throat dry. "My apartment. You had an accident. I pulled you out before your car exploded," Isabella explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian took a moment to process her words. The memories were hazy, but flashes of the crash, the storm, and the heat of the fire surfaced in his mind. He stared at her, gratitude mixing with curiosity. "You saved my life." A soft blush crept up Isabella's cheeks as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Adrian countered, his voice gaining strength. "Not everyone would risk their life for a stranger." The air between them grew heavy, an unspoken tension settling over them. Adrian couldn't take his eyes off her. She was different from the people he usually surrounded himself with, people who only sought wealth and power. She had no idea who he was, yet she had saved him without hesitation. As the hours passed, conversation flowed effortlessly between them. They spoke of dreams, regrets, and the loneliness that wealth and struggle alike could bring. A connection, intense and undeniable, formed between them. One moment, they were sitting across from each other, and the next, Adrian reached for her, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. Isabella's breath hitched, and before she could stop herself, she leaned in. That night, wrapped in each other's arms, they forgot the world outside. It was reckless. It was unplanned. But it was real. By the time morning light crept through the curtains, Isabella was gone. Adrian woke to an empty bed, his heart sinking. She had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the lingering scent of lavender and a memory that would haunt him forever. Isabella sat in the small bathroom of her apartment, staring at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs. 2 pink lines, a confirmation of something that would change her life forever. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She clutched the plastic stick, feeling as if the walls around her were closing in. How could this be happening? How had one night, one incredible, passionate, reckless night led to this? Adrian Carter. His name echoed in her mind like a ghost from a life she no longer belonged to. She could still feel the heat of his touch, the way he had held her as if she was the only thing that mattered. But that was an illusion. He belonged to a world of power, money, and cold, calculated decisions. There was no place for a child in that world. She pressed a hand against her stomach, overwhelmed by an indescribable mix of love and fear. This wasn't just her life anymore. This was a tiny, fragile existence growing inside her, and she had to protect it at all costs. Her thoughts raced. Could she tell Adrian? Number. Even if she found a way to contact him, what would he say? Would he want the baby? Would he take the child from her, claim him as an heir to his empire? The idea sent a shiver down her spine. She had seen his ruthless nature in the headlines, the way he crushed competitors without mercy. She couldn't risk it. That night, Isabella made a decision. She would leave New York, disappear before Adrian ever had a chance to find out. The bus ride to the quiet town of Willowbrook was long and silent. Isabella clutched her bag to her chest, feeling the weight of her choices settle over her. She had left behind everything she knew, her job, her tiny apartment, the city she had called home for years. Months passed, and as her belly grew, so did her resolve. She found a job as a school teacher, built a life surrounded by kind-hearted people who asked no questions about her past. And then, one stormy night, she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, Leo. He had Adrian's piercing blue eyes. Every time she looked at him, she was reminded of the man she had left behind. She had escaped Adrian's world. But deep down, she knew the truth. No matter how far she ran, some secrets could never stay buried forever. The city skyline had long faded from Isabella's memories, replaced by the rolling hills and peaceful streets of Willowbrook. For 5 years, she had carefully built a life of quiet contentment. No one here knew of her past, nor did they question the absence of a father in Leo's life. The sleepy town embraced her as one of its own, and she, in turn, made it her sanctuary. Isabella walked down the narrow sidewalk, holding Leo's tiny hand. His small fingers curled around hers as he skipped beside her, humming a cheerful tune. His bright blue eyes sparkled with excitement as he recounted his day at school, his voice filled with the innocent joy of childhood. "Mommy, Miss Taylor said I was the best at reading today." Leo beamed, his chest puffed out with pride. Isabella smiled, running her fingers through his dark curls. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." She never imagined raising a child alone. But Leo had brought a kind of happiness into her life that she never knew was possible. He was her entire world. Every decision she made, every sacrifice, was for him. But no matter how much she tried to suppress the past, it had a way of creeping back in. Each time she looked into Leo's eyes, she saw Adrian. The resemblance was undeniable. The same piercing blue gaze, the same determined set of his jaw when he was deep in thought. And with each passing year, her fear of being discovered grew stronger. She shook off the lingering worry, focusing on the present. The sun was setting, casting golden hues across the small town as they made their way home. She inhaled deeply, feeling the crisp autumn air fill her lungs. This was their life now. Simple, safe, happy. Or so she thought. As they rounded the corner onto their quiet street, a sleek black car stood parked in front of their house. The sight of it sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. It was too luxurious, too out of place in their humble neighborhood. She tightened her grip on Leo's hand, her pulse quickening. A man stood beside the car, his broad shoulders tense, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the surroundings. The moment their eyes met, Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Adrian Carter. A wave of shock and dread washed over her. He was here. After all these years, he had found them. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. The world around her seemed to blur as Adrian took a slow step forward. His gaze locked onto hers, and in that instant she knew he recognized her. Isabella. Her name on his lips sent a jolt through her body. It had been 5 years since she had last heard his voice, but it still carried the same deep timbre, the same authority that sent shivers down her spine. Leo tugged at her hand, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. "Mommy, who's that man?" Isabella couldn't speak. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions. How had he found her? What did he want? Did he know the truth? Adrian's gaze dropped to the small boy beside her, and Isabella saw the exact moment realization dawned on him. His eyes widened, his breath hitching as he took in the little face that mirrored his own. Leo Carter. Adrian looked back at her, betrayal and something deeper swirling in his gaze. "Is he?" His voice faltered, uncharacteristically unsure. Isabella's heart shattered. She had spent years dreading this moment, and now it was here. She had no choice but to face the man she had once loved, the man she had hidden their son from. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she held her ground. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "please don't do this here." But it was too late. Their lives were about to change forever. Adrian Carter had always been a man of control. Every decision he made was calculated, every move precise. But as he stood in the middle of a crowded school charity event, he felt something he hadn't in years: shock. The event had been nothing more than a formality, a gesture of goodwill from Carter Enterprises. He had been only half listening as he observed the children playing, their laughter ringing through the crisp afternoon air. Then his gaze landed on a single child, a boy with unruly dark curls and striking blue eyes. The world around him faded, a ringing sound taking over his ears. He knew those eyes. He had seen them every morning in the mirror. They were his. For a moment, Adrian thought he was hallucinating. But no, this child was real. He stood among a group of children, clutching a book and smiling in a way that was eerily familiar. His chest tightened, his breath uneven as he took a step closer. His mind spun with questions. Who was this child? Why did he look exactly like him? As he studied the boy, his sharp instincts kicked in. The resemblance was too strong to be a coincidence. This child, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, was the exact age that aligned with the night Isabella had vanished from his life. Adrian clenched his fists, a mixture of emotions surging through him. Anger, confusion, hope. Could it be? His gaze darted around the schoolyard, searching for a familiar face. And then, as if the universe was playing a cruel trick on him, he saw her. Isabella. She was standing near the entrance, speaking with another teacher. Her long, dark hair was pulled into a loose braid, and she wore a modest yet elegant dress. But it was the look in her eyes, guarded, almost fearful, that made his stomach drop. She knew. She knew he had seen the boy. She knew he had figured it out. And she was afraid. Adrian's jaw tightened. He had spent years searching for her, tormented by the memory of the woman who had saved him and vanished. Now he had not only found her, but he had found something far greater, his son. A storm of emotions raged within him. He wanted answers. He wanted the truth. But most of all, he wanted to know why she had kept his child from him. As if sensing his presence, Isabella's head snapped toward him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time stood still. Then she turned and fled. But Adrian wasn't letting her escape this time. Adrian Carter was not a man who accepted uncertainty. His life was built on control, power, and precision. He had spent years crafting an empire where every move was calculated, every decision was backed by research, and every loose end was tied up before it could ever threaten him. Yet for the past 5 years, there had been one loose end he could never quite grasp. Isabella, the woman who had saved his life, shared a night of passion with him, and then vanished without a trace. He had searched. Oh, how he had searched. Money, resources, private investigators, none of it had been enough to track her down. It was as if she had been nothing more than a beautiful illusion. Until now. Standing in front of the local elementary school, his entire world had just tilted off its axis. The moment his gaze landed on the boy, he knew. It wasn't just a suspicion. It was a certainty that rattled him to his core. The child was his, Leo. Adrian had spent the last 24 hours in a haze of rage, confusion, and an aching sense of betrayal. He had pulled every string he had, contacted every source in his network, and within hours, he had what he needed: an address, details of her life, and undeniable proof that Isabella Evans had been hiding their son from him. As he stood outside the modest house in the small town of Willowbrook, Adrian felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. What would he say to her? What explanation could she possibly give for keeping his son a secret? The thought sent a fresh wave of anger surging through him. He had missed 5 years of his child's life. 5 years he would never get back. Clenching his jaw, he knocked on the door. Silence. He knocked again, harder this time. Footsteps. A pause. Then the door cracked open just enough for him to see those familiar brown eyes staring up at him in shock. Adrian! Her voice was barely a whisper, but he heard it like a gunshot. She tried to shut the door, but he was faster. He pushed against it, stepping inside before she could stop him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice sharp with restrained emotion. Isabella's eyes darted behind him, panic flashing across her face. "Adrian, please! Leo is home." The name alone sent a jolt through him. He stepped forward, towering over her. "I know." She sucked in a sharp breath, realization settling over her like a dark cloud. She backed away from him as if she could physically escape the confrontation, but Adrian wasn't letting her run this time. 5 years, Isabella. His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the storm beneath it. 5 years, and not once did you think to tell me I had a son. Her lips trembled, and for a moment he thought she might break down. But then something shifted in her expression, defiance. "I did what was best for Leo," she said softly. "I protected him." Adrian let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Protected him? From what? Me?" Her silence was answer enough. Adrian stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You had no right." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I was scared, Adrian. You were in a world filled with power and danger. I didn't want my son, our son, to be a part of that." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling sharply. "You don't get to make that decision alone." Isabella wrapped her arms around herself, her body visibly shaking. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I had to think about what was best for Leo." A lump formed in Adrian's throat. 5 years. 5 years of missed birthdays, of first words, first steps, moments he could never get back. "Does he know about me?" he asked finally, his voice rough. She hesitated, then shook her head. Something inside Adrian cracked. Before he could speak, a small voice rang out from behind Isabella. "Mommy?" Both of them froze. Isabella turned slowly, revealing a small boy standing at the top of the staircase, rubbing his sleepy eyes. His dark curls were tousled, his pajamas slightly oversized. Adrian couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Leo blinked at him, curiosity flickering in his bright blue eyes. "Who's that man?" A sharp pain pierced Adrian's chest. Isabella turned to face their son, her body visibly tense. "Leo, sweetheart, this is—" She hesitated, and for the first time in his life, Adrian felt genuine fear. Would she lie to their son? Would she push him out of his own child's life? His gaze locked onto hers, silently pleading. Then she took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Adrian," she said, her voice trembling. He's your father." The words hit Adrian like a sledgehammer. Leo's eyes widened, his small face scrunched in confusion. "My dad?" Adrian's throat tightened. He wanted to move, to speak, to reach out, but he was frozen. Isabella knelt beside Leo, gently brushing his curls away from his face. "Yes, baby, he's your dad." Leo looked at Adrian for a long moment, then turned back to Isabella. "Why didn't I know?" Tears slipped from Isabella's eyes as she cupped her son's face. "I was scared, sweetheart. But I promise we're going to figure this out." Adrian took a slow, unsteady step forward. His voice was rough with emotion. "Leo, I would have been here if I had known. I would have been here every day." Leo looked at him carefully, studying him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Then, to Adrian's absolute shock, the boy smiled. "It's okay," he said simply. "You're here now." Adrian felt his heart shatter and rebuild all at once. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But at that moment, with his son looking at him with hope instead of anger, he knew one thing. He would never let them go again. And this time, no secret would stand between them. Adrian Carter had always been a man in control of his emotions, his empire, his destiny. But standing in Isabella's modest home, staring into her tear-filled eyes, he felt anything but in control. He felt betrayed. His chest rose and fell with the force of his emotions. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, struggling to contain the storm raging inside him. "Is he mine?" His voice was sharp, almost a growl, filled with an aching pain he couldn't mask. Isabella took a shaky breath, her lips trembling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She had spent years preparing for this moment, yet now that it was here, she felt like she was drowning. "Yes," she whispered. Adrian staggered back as if she had physically struck him. His heart pounded violently in his chest. The confirmation should have soothed him, but instead it burned. For 5 years his son had existed in the world, without him. His voice was raw when he spoke again. "You kept him from me." Isabella wiped her tears with trembling hands. "Adrian, You kept him from me." His voice was lower now, filled with unspoken agony. "I had no choice," she cried out, wrapping her arms around herself as if shielding herself from his fury. "I was scared." Adrian let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Scared of what? That I'd be a bad father?" His eyes were dark, filled with something unreadable. "Or scared that I wouldn't let you disappear again?" She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated. Adrian took a slow, measured step toward her. "Do you have any idea what you've taken from me?" His voice broke slightly, betraying the emotion he tried so hard to control. 5 years, Isabella. 5. I missed his first words, his first steps. I missed everything. Tears streamed freely down her face now. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Adrian let out a bitter laugh. "You're sorry? That's supposed to make up for everything?" Isabella flinched. She knew he had every right to be angry, but he didn't understand the full story. "I didn't do this to hurt you," she said desperately. "I did it to protect him." Adrian's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Protect him? From what? Me?" She shook her head violently. "No, not you, Adrian. Your world." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. My world? Adrian repeated, his voice eerily calm. Isabella took a deep breath, her fingers digging into the fabric of her sweater. You're Adrian Carter, the billionaire, the businessman. But you're also the man whose company has enemies. I saw the headlines, the scandals, the lawsuits, the threats. I couldn't risk my son growing up in a world where he might be a pawn in someone's game. Adrian's jaw tightened. You don't get to make that decision for me. Her breath hitched. I know, she admitted, but at the time I thought I was doing the right thing. He stared at her, eyes dark with emotions he wasn't sure he could name. He wanted to be furious. He wanted to yell, to demand she make up for every moment he had lost. But underneath his anger he saw something else. Fear. Not fear of him, but fear of losing their son. Adrian swallowed hard, his voice quieter now. Did you ever think about telling me? She nodded barely. So many times. But every time I tried, I convinced myself you'd take him away from me. His heart clenched painfully. I would never do that. Her gaze met his, searching. Wouldn't you? A part of him wanted to say yes, to remind her that he had the power to take Leo away, to fight for custody, to use his influence to make sure she never kept him from his son again. But another part of him, one he wasn't ready to acknowledge, knew the truth. Leo needed his mother. And despite everything, Adrian still needed Isabella too. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. I don't know how to forgive this. She closed her eyes, nodding. I don't expect you to. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. He had walked into this house expecting answers. He hadn't expected his heart to break. Silence stretched between them until Adrian finally spoke. I want to see him. Isabella's breath caught. What? I want to know my son, he said, his voice firm. You can't keep him from me anymore. She hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Adrian released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a start. And for now, that had to be enough. Adrian Carter had conquered boardrooms, built an empire, and faced ruthless adversaries without flinching. But standing in front of a wide-eyed 5-year-old boy who barely knew him, he felt the one thing he never had before: fear. Leo stood next to Isabella, his small hand gripping the hem of her sweater. His brown curls were slightly tousled. His deep green eyes so much like Adrian's, studying him with open curiosity but also caution. Adrian had prepared for this moment. He had run through every possible scenario in his head, but nothing could have prepared him for the way his heart clenched, seeing his own son hesitate to come near him. Hi, Leo, Adrian said, forcing his voice to be softer than he was used to. Leo blinked up at him but said nothing. Isabella placed a reassuring hand on Leo's back. Sweetheart, this is Adrian. She hesitated, her throat tightening. He's your father. The words sent a ripple of emotions through Adrian, but he forced himself to stay focused on Leo's reaction. The boy tilted his head, his tiny fingers tightening in his mother's sweater. You're really my dad? His voice was small, unsure. Adrian crouched down to meet him at eye level. Yes, he said, nodding. I am. Leo stared at him for a long moment, his little brows furrowing. Where were you? The question hit Adrian like a punch to the gut. He swallowed. How could he explain that he never even knew Leo existed? That his mother had made a choice to keep them apart? That Adrian had spent years searching for a woman who had vanished without a trace? Isabella stepped in gently. Leo, it's complicated. But Adrian didn't know about you before. If he had, he would have been here. Leo looked between them, his expression unreadable. Then he simply said, Oh. Adrian exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a bad one. Leo shifted slightly on his feet. Do you like dinosaurs? He asked suddenly. Adrian blinked. Dinosaurs? Leo nodded, his face still serious. They're my favorite. Adrian hesitated for only a second before saying, Then I guess I like them too. For the first time since they met, Leo's lips twitched into the hint of a smile. Isabella let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was the beginning. The days that followed were slow and delicate. Adrian didn't push. He didn't try to force himself into Leo's life all at once. Instead, he did something Isabella never thought she would see. He let his guard down. Adrian Carter, the billionaire CEO known for his ruthless efficiency, sat on the floor of Isabella's living room, flipping through dinosaur books with his son. He listened intently as Leo explained the differences between a T-Rex and a velociraptor. One afternoon, when Isabella returned from running errands, she found the two of them in the backyard. Adrian was holding a soccer ball, while Leo barked out instructions like a miniature coach. "No, Daddy, you have to kick it like this," Leo demonstrated, his little foot tapping the ball. Adrian, who could negotiate billion-dollar deals in his sleep, nodded seriously as if his son's advice were the most important thing in the world. "Got it." He attempted the kick, only for the ball to roll pathetically off to the side. Leo giggled. That was terrible. Adrian let out a laugh, a real, unguarded laugh Isabella had never heard before. She watched them from the doorway, her heart swelling. It was happening. Her son was learning to trust his father, and Adrian, he was becoming a father in every sense of the word. One night, Isabella stood outside Leo's room, listening. "Good night, Daddy," Leo's sleepy voice murmured. A pause. Then Adrian's deep but gentle voice responded, "Good night, kiddo." Tears pricked Isabella's eyes. She had been afraid for so long, afraid of what Adrian's presence would mean for Leo, afraid of the past catching up to them. But in that moment she realized something. Leo wasn't just safe with Adrian. He was loved, and so was she. The night was unusually still, a suffocating silence hanging over Isabella's small house. She had just finished tucking Leo into bed, his tiny body curled beneath his dinosaur blanket, his soft snores filling the room. As she stood by his door watching him sleep, a sense of peace washed over her. For the first time in years, things felt right. Adrian had become a part of their lives, not just as the powerful billionaire she once feared, but as a father, Leo's father. She had seen the way Leo's eyes lit up whenever Adrian was around, the way Adrian softened, letting down walls he had spent a lifetime building. It was beautiful and terrifying, because deep down, she knew happiness like this never lasted. A sharp knock at the front door jolted her from her thoughts. Her heart jumped. Who would be visiting this late? She hesitated before making her way to the door, glancing at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Too late for a casual visit. Her stomach tightened as she peeked through the peephole. No one was there. A chill crept down her spine. Slowly, she unlocked the door and pulled it open just a crack, glancing around. The street was empty. The soft glow of streetlights illuminated the quiet neighborhood. Then she saw it, a small black envelope lying on her doormat. Her breath hitched. With trembling fingers, she picked it up and carefully peeled it open. A single sheet of paper slipped out. The moment her eyes landed on the words scrawled across it, icy fear gripped her chest. "Leave Adrian Carter or suffer the consequences. Your son is not safe." The world spun. Her pulse roared in her ears as she reread the message, her fingers tightening around the note. No name, no signature, just a clear, bone-chilling threat. She sucked in a shaky breath, forcing herself to think. Who sent this? There was only one answer: Adrian's enemies. He had told her about them in passing, how being the CEO of Carter Enterprises meant making powerful adversaries, competitors, criminals, people who would do anything to bring him down. And now they had found his weakness: Leo. A sharp wave of nausea rolled through her. She spun around, racing back inside, locking the door behind her. Every muscle in her body screamed, "Protect Leo." She needed to get out of here, to run. But would running even help? She gripped her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Adrian's number. It barely rang before he answered. "Isabella." His voice was sharp, alert. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The fear lodged in her throat like a knife. "Isabella, what's wrong?" His tone dropped, now filled with something dangerous. She swallowed hard, gripping the letter so tightly it crumpled in her palm. "They know," she whispered. Silence. Then, in a voice so lethal it sent a shiver down her spine, Adrian said, "Who?" She exhaled shakily. "I don't know, but they know about Leo, and they're watching us." A sharp intake of breath. "Pack your things," he ordered, his voice steel. "I'm coming to get you." She hesitated. "Adrian, I'm not asking." His voice softened, but the authority in it remained. "You and Leo are coming with me. I won't let them touch you." Her throat tightened. Could she trust him to keep them safe? Then she looked at the note again. "Your son is not safe." She had no choice. Tears burned her eyes as she whispered, "Hurry." The night had never felt darker. Isabella paced the living room, her fingers trembling as she gripped her phone, waiting for Adrian to call. He had promised to send security, but her heart pounded relentlessly, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. Then she heard it. A crash. The sound of shattering glass from Leo's bedroom. Her blood ran cold. "Leo!" she screamed, sprinting toward his room, her bare feet skidding across the hardwood floor. She slammed the door open, just in time to see a masked figure climbing out of the window, Leo's small body limp in his arms. For a moment, time stopped. Then instinct kicked in. "No!" Isabella lunged, grabbing Leo's arm, trying to pull him back. The kidnapper twisted, yanking the boy away from her grasp. Leo stirred, his groggy voice barely a whisper. "Mommy!" Isabella's heart shattered. She clawed at the intruder, kicking, screaming, fighting with everything she had. But he was too strong. With one final shove, he sent her crashing against the dresser. Pain exploded through her ribs as she hit the floor. Distantly, she heard the sound of tires screeching outside. Then silence. Leo was gone. The next few minutes were a blur. Isabella stumbled to her feet, her vision swimming. She reached for her phone with shaking fingers and dialed the only person who could save her son. "Adrian!" He answered immediately. "Isabella!" She couldn't breathe. "They took him." The silence that followed was deadly. Then his voice came, low and dangerous. "Who?" "I don't know. They broke in. They took Leo." She was sobbing now, her body trembling violently. A sound, something between a growl and a curse, escaped Adrian. "I swear to God, I'll kill them." She heard movement on his end, the sound of doors slamming, people barking orders in the background. "I'm on my way," he said, voice laced with fury. "I'll find him. I swear, Isabella, I'll bring our son home." Adrian had never felt rage like this before. His mind was a storm of chaos, but his actions were precise, deadly. His men were already tracking the vehicle's last known location, scanning traffic cameras, searching every possible lead. He stood in his private office, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. His world had always been ruthless, filled with enemies who wanted to see him fall. But they had made a grave mistake. They had taken his son. A man in a suit rushed in, his face grim. "Sir, we found them. An abandoned warehouse at the docks." Adrian didn't hesitate. "Prepare the team," he ordered. "We're going in." Isabella gripped Adrian's arm as they stood outside the warehouse. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. Adrian turned to her, his gaze intense. "Number, stay here." Her eyes flashed with defiance. "He's my son, too." Adrian exhaled sharply. There was no time to argue. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Stay behind me." Then they moved. Inside the warehouse, Leo sat bound to a chair, his small frame trembling. A man circled him, a wicked smirk on his lips. "Your daddy should have stayed out of our business, kid." Leo's green eyes, so much like Adrian's, were filled with terror. Then a loud bang echoed through the warehouse. The doors burst open. Adrian Carter stormed in like a force of nature, his eyes burning with fury. The kidnapper barely had time to react before Adrian's fist connected with his face, sending him crashing to the floor. Gunfire erupted. Chaos ensued. Through it all, Isabella ran straight to Leo, untying the ropes, gathering him into her arms. "Mommy!" he sobbed, clinging to her. Adrian was by their side in seconds, dropping to his knees, his hands cradling his son's face. "Leo!" his voice broke. "Daddy!" Relief and emotion crashed over Adrian like a tidal wave. He pulled Leo into his arms, holding him tightly, vowing in that moment that no one would ever take his son away from him again. The nightmare was over. But Adrian knew one thing. Whoever had done this, whoever had dared to threaten his family, would regret it. The clock was ticking. Every passing second was torture. Adrian Carter stood in the dimly lit surveillance room of his private security headquarters. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His hands curled into fists as he stared at the live feed from the drone hovering over an abandoned shipyard on the city's outskirts. His son was in there. Every fiber of his being burned with rage. "They messed with the wrong man," he muttered under his breath. His second in command, Damian Blackwood, stood beside him, his expression unreadable. "We have a team in position. We go in on your command." Adrian's eyes darkened. "We go in now." The night was thick with tension as Adrian and his elite team of security operatives moved through the shadows. Dressed in tactical gear, their steps were silent, their guns loaded. Inside the hideout, Leo sat tied to a chair, his small body trembling. His captors laughed as they made a call. "Carter's going to pay through the nose for this," one of them sneered, holding up a phone. "Or maybe we just get rid of the kid and send him a message instead." Leo whimpered. He was scared, but he wasn't weak. "My daddy is going to find you," he said, his voice shaking but fierce. "And he's going to make you sorry." The men laughed. "Brave kid. Too bad bravery won't save you." A deafening bang rang through the warehouse. The lights flickered. The door exploded inward. And then chaos. Adrian was the first inside, his gun raised, his movement swift and lethal. His team followed, shots fired with precision. The kidnappers scrambled, cursing as they reached for their weapons. But they were no match. Adrian moved like a predator, his rage fueling him as he took them down one by one. Within seconds, silence fell. Adrian's eyes darted across the room until they landed on Leo. Bound, shaking, eyes wide with fear. "Leo!" Adrian ran to him, his heart slamming against his ribs. He dropped his gun, his hands trembling as he ripped the ropes away. Leo let out a sob. "Daddy!" Adrian pulled him into his arms, holding him so tightly it hurt. "I've got you, buddy. I've got you." Leo's little hands clung to his father's shirt, his small body shaking. "I was so scared." Adrian's throat tightened. "I know, but I swear I will never let anything happen to you again." A movement in the corner of his eye. One of the kidnappers, bloodied, barely standing, raised a gun. Adrian's instincts kicked in. He twisted, shielding Leo, his arms tightening around his son. A shot rang out, but it wasn't Adrian who fired. It was Isabella. She stood in the doorway, her hands shaking, her face pale, but her aim was steady. The man collapsed, his gun falling from his grasp. Adrian stared at her, his heart pounding. "Isabella!" She let out a shaky breath, lowering the gun. "No one touches my son." For the first time in his life, Adrian Carter felt his heart break and mend at the same time. Leo was safe. His family was whole. And now it was time to destroy anyone who had dared to threaten them. The night air was thick with tension, yet a strange sense of peace settled over Isabella as she sat on the balcony of Adrian's penthouse, gazing at the glittering city skyline. The events of the past few days had been a whirlwind, a nightmare that had nearly stolen everything from her. But Leo was safe. Adrian had kept his promise. She turned to look inside, where Adrian sat on the couch, his head in his hands. His strong, composed exterior had cracked in those terrifying hours when Leo had been taken, and now the weight of it all was pressing down on him. For the first time, Isabella saw the man beneath the billionaire, the father who had almost lost his son, the man who had almost lost her. She took a deep breath and walked inside. Adrian looked up, his stormy gray eyes locking onto hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a hoarse voice, he said, "I thought I'd lost you both." Isabella felt something inside her break. "You didn't," she whispered, stepping closer. "You never lost me, Adrian." His eyes darkened. "Didn't I?" She swallowed, her hands trembling. "I left because I was scared, not of you, but of your world, of what being with you would mean for Leo." She paused, tears threatening to spill. "But tonight, when I held that gun, when I pulled the trigger to protect my son, I realized something." Adrian stood, his towering frame closing the distance between them. "What?" he asked softly. She exhaled shakily. "That I was never running from you. I was running from myself." She let out a broken laugh. "From how much I loved you." Adrian froze. The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. Isabella blinked back tears. "I never stopped, Adrian. Not for a second." A sharp breath escaped him, his hands reaching for her, cupping her face with such tenderness it made her heart ache. "Say it again," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I love you." A broken sound left his lips, and before she could say another word, he kissed her. It wasn't the kind of kiss they had shared that night 5 years ago, one filled with passion and uncertainty. This was deeper, stronger, a kiss that carried years of longing, pain, and love unspoken. When they finally broke apart, Adrian pressed his forehead to hers. His breaths were uneven, his hands still cradling her face. "I love you too, Isabella," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I never stopped." She let out a sob, her fingers clutching his shirt. Adrian exhaled sharply as if making a decision. Then slowly he pulled something from his pocket. Isabella gasped. A ring. A breathtaking diamond ring that sparkled under the dim lights of the penthouse. Adrian dropped to one knee, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't want to waste another second without you," he said. "You and Leo are my everything, and I swear I will spend every day protecting you, loving you, and making up for all the years we lost." His voice trembled. "Marry me, Isabella." Her heart stopped. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, a sob escaping her lips. "Yes," she choked out. "Yes, Adrian. 1,000 times yes." Adrian slid the ring onto her finger, then stood, pulling her into his arms. And as they kissed, Isabella knew this was where she was meant to be. Forever. The day was perfect. The sun cast a golden glow over the sprawling gardens of the Carter estate, where twinkling fairy lights hung from ancient oak trees, and fragrant white roses lined the aisle. Soft music played, weaving through the air like a melody of love and new beginnings. Isabella stood at the entrance, her heart hammering in her chest. She had never imagined this moment, not after years of running, not after believing love was something too fragile, too fleeting to last. But here she was, dressed in a gown of ivory lace, a vision of beauty and hope. And beside her stood Leo, her son, her strength, the proof of the love that had never truly faded. He looked up at her with bright green eyes, Adrian's eyes. A tiny suit hugged his small frame, and his little hand gripped hers tightly. "Are you happy, Mommy?" Tears welled in Isabella's eyes. She knelt to his level, cupping his cheek. "I've never been happier, my love." Leo grinned, then glanced down the aisle. "Daddy's waiting." Isabella followed his gaze. Adrian stood at the altar looking impossibly handsome in his tailored black tux. But it wasn't his suit, his wealth, or the grand setting that took her breath away. It was the way he looked at her, as if she was his entire world. Their eyes met, and in that moment, every fear, every hardship, every tear they had shed was washed away. Taking a deep breath, Isabella rose, and hand in hand with Leo, she walked down the aisle toward her forever. The ceremony was beautiful, every word spoken filled with raw emotion. When the officiant turned to Adrian, asking for his vows, he took Isabella's hands in his fingers warm and strong around hers. "I never believed in fate," he began, his deep voice thick with emotion. "I never believed in love either. Not until the night you saved my life." His eyes burned into hers. "You showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it. You gave me a son, our son. And you gave me something I never thought I'd have, a home." Isabella swallowed the sob that rose in her throat. Adrian squeezed her hands. "I spent 5 years searching for you, not just because I needed answers, but because without you, nothing in my life made sense. And now that I have you back, I swear on everything I have, I will never let you go again." A single tear slipped down his cheek as he whispered, "I love you, Isabella. And I always will." The crowd sniffled, the raw sincerity of his words leaving no eye dry. Isabella's hands trembled as she lifted her gaze to him. "I was scared of love," she admitted, "scared of getting hurt, of losing the people I cared about. But the truth is, loving you was never the hard part. It was living without you that hurt the most." A tear slipped from her eye, but Adrian brushed it away with his thumb. "I love you, Adrian," she continued, her voice shaking, "and I vow to stand by you, to love you and to never run again, because you are my home." Adrian let out a breath, as if he had been holding it all this time. Then, as the officiant declared them husband and wife, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with everything he had. Cheers erupted around them, but Isabella only felt Adrian, his warmth, his love, his promise. Leo ran up to them, his little arms wrapping around their legs. Adrian lifted him effortlessly, holding his wife and son together as one. "I love you both," Adrian murmured. Leo giggled. "Can I have cake now?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Isabella smiled, pressing a kiss to her son's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, looking at Adrian with pure love in her eyes. "We have all the time in the world now." And for the first time in years, Isabella knew she was home forever.